If you're studying a text that has a character in it, you got to complete this lesson.
Everything you need to easily pass English ATAR. English ATAR made simple. Powered by Saints Coaching.
Welcome back. This lesson is all about characterization. Here are all the times the concept of characterization or a version of it has appeared in a past WACE exam question between 2016 and 2022. Like a mood, the concept from the previous lesson, characterization isn't mentioned in the syllabus. Hold it right there. Once again, before you consider ignoring this lesson, stopping it right now and going to the next one, hear me out. There are two reasons why we're looking at this concept of characterization. As we just saw, it's appeared in a decent amount of exam questions. If it had only appeared in one past WACE exam question, might not be worth looking at it in a lesson, but because it's appeared in 3, I really believe that it warrants some attention. Reason number 2, you can discuss this concept of characterization in a lot of questions, even if the question doesn't explicitly mention the concept. We'll discuss that a bit later on. But for now, just please take my word on it. It is worthwhile watching this video lesson and completing the related activities, which, by the way, are very short. Lesson objectives. Firstly, we will define characterization. We'll outline the types of characterization. We'll define author characterization, define audience characterization, compare the types of characterization, outline the conventions of characterization, analyze some past WACE exam questions, discuss analyzing conventions of characterization, discuss creating conventions of characterization, and then outline a simple summary. Starting with the definition of characterization, what does it mean? What is our definition? A good definition is the process by which ideas about a character are constructed and conveyed. These two underlined words, constructed and conveyed, refer to the two different types of characterization, and they have slightly different meanings. So what exactly does each word mean? Construct and convey. The Oxford Dictionary of English defines construct as form, in brackets, an idea or theory by bringing together various conceptual elements. On the other hand, the Oxford Dictionary of English defines convey as make, an idea, impression, or feeling, known or understandable. So construct basically means to create something, whereas convey means to show something. And that leads us to our two types of characterization. Starting with audience characterization, which refers to the process by which an audience constructs ideas about a character. That's our first type. What about our second type? That is author characterization, which refers to the process by which an author conveys ideas about a character. Once again, notice the use of the word constructs in audience characterization and the use of the word conveys in author characterization. What this is telling us is that the audience forms or creates ideas about a character in their own mind, whereas the author conveys or shows idea about a character. I know this distinction sounds quite blurry at the moment, but we will get to some examples which I believe will make the distinction much clearer. Side note, who is an author? In everyday life, if I mention the word author, you would probably say in response that that is the person who has written a written text, a novel. But in English ATAR, because in English ATAR we like to make things sound confusing, an author is defined as this: the composer or originator of a work, for example, a novel, film, website, speech, essay, autobiography. As we can see, this comes from the syllabus glossary section. The takeaway from this definition is that in English ATAR, an author simply refers to the creator of any text. And that is really evidenced in our definition through the example of a film. The syllabus is telling us that we can refer to the creator of a film as an author, even though one would ordinarily refer to the creator of a film as the director. Bear in mind that this term author is kind of an umbrella term under which the more specific ways of referring to text creators fall under. For instance, the example I used before, author, umbrella term. I can refer to a director as an author. I can also just refer to a director as a director. Moving on to the types of characterization compared. As we can see in this table, each type of characterization is relevant to a different category of exam question. By this stage, we know there are two categories of exam questions, analytical and creative. Audience characterization is relevant to analytical questions, which come from the comprehending section of the exam and the responding section of the exam. Why is that? Quite simply because these questions require you to analyze and construct ideas about characters and texts. If I am watching John Wick 4, I might construct the idea about John Wick that he is extremely persistent and he doesn't give up. On the other hand, with author characterization, that one is relevant to creative questions and specifically imaginative questions in the composing section. Bearing in mind that you can create 3 different text types in the composing section, one of which is an imaginative text, another one is persuasive, and another one is interpretive. The rationale for this is that these questions require you to create and convey ideas about characters in a text. If I am the director of John Wick 4, who, by the way, was Keanu Reeves' stuntman in The Matrix, I might convey the idea that John Wick is very persistent by showing him always getting back up once he gets knocked down. This table brings us to a key takeaway that clearly tells us how both types of characterization are different. And that key takeaway is the ideas an author conveys about a character sometimes differ from those an audience constructs about said character. In that example about John Wick 4, the idea an author conveys about a character was the same as the idea the audience, me, constructed about said character, John Wick, and that underlying similar idea was that John Wick is very persistent. Now we're looking at where those two ideas between author characterization and audience characterization differ. Might sound pretty abstract. Here's a further explanation. The first thing to note is that in imaginative text, you're hardly ever directly told what sort of person a character is. Instead, the author implies ideas about that character. For instance, the author, director of Captain America: The First Avenger didn't need to include a narration of this shot saying that Captain America is big and strong. The idea about the character that he's big and strong is implied by the size of his muscles and how big he looks in comparison to the other people in this shot, like the 2 dudes in the lab coats here. So that's a fairly obvious example of how an author can imply an idea about a character. But because ideas about characters are more often implied and rarely just directly told to us as an audience, sometimes the audience can infer or make their own meaning about a character that the author didn't intentionally imply. For example, I doubt Joel Schumacher, the guy who directed Batman and Robin, which came out in 1997, intended to imply any meaning in particular by including nipples on the Batsuit. However, the audience inferred that including the nipples was just a joke, and it consequently became the subject of many memes. So far, we've looked at 2 types of characterization, how they're relevant to you in an exam context, and what the difference between those 2 types are. And that's done through conventions of characterization. As we know from the lessons on genre, conventions are things that are typically done. With that in mind, conventions of characterization are things that are typically used to characterize a character in a story. What is the significance of the conventions of characterization? Why even bother discussing it? The significance is we should identify these conventions to analyze ideas about a character in analytical questions, and we should use these conventions to create ideas about a character, creative questions. With that being said, what are the conventions of characterization? What are the things that are typically used to characterize a character in a text? They are, firstly, behavior, body language, characters' thoughts, dialogue, name, narratorial commentary, reactions of other characters, physical appearance, and setting. Let's take a closer look at each one, starting with behavior. This simply refers to what the character does and how the character behaves. Example, Angela in Stranger Things 4 bullies 11. And as we can see on the slide, 11 gets fed up and punches Angela with a roller skate. Next one, body language. This simply refers to the conscious and unconscious movements and postures by which attitudes and feelings are communicated. For example, if you're sitting upright, that communicates this idea that someone is confident, powerful, strong, assertive. On the other hand, if you're hunched, that communicates ideas that you're lazy, sad, tired, weak. Character's thoughts. This refers to what the character is thinking and provides an insight into their true nature. Our example for this one is an excerpt of a book called Upgrade, which came out in 2022. It's written by Blake Crouch. He's easily one of my favorite authors. Two of his books in particular, one called Recursion and the other called Dark Matter. If you're considering getting into reading, but you don't want to touch any of the things that you have to study at school, those two books in particular are a great place to start. It feels like you're reading a movie, and there's no real way to fully explain that. You just have to go and read them. Anyway, fanboying aside, the excerpt of this book, Upgrade, is in the PDF study notes, and I'll read it out now. A bit of context. The protagonist is writing letters to his wife that he hasn't seen in ages because he was infected with this virus that upgraded his abilities and had to hide from the authorities. For this reason, because he's being tracked, the protagonist can't send the letters, but he nonetheless continues to write these letters so he can express his thoughts. I'm not being honest, Beth. I'm writing the things old Logan would write, driven by some vestigial nostalgia for my past life. If I can't be honest with you, even when it's painful, what's the point? Interacting with people has become a challenge. Imagine knowing what someone is trying to say long before they inelegantly manage to say it. Imagine being intensely aware of every micro expression that belies their words. Imagine a chasm between you and everyone else. Imagine not feeling human anymore. For me, now, speaking with a bright adult feels like what it used to feel like to hold a conversation with a 10-year-old. I know that sounds shitty, but it's the truth. That's the excerpt, and it tells us that this protagonist feels isolated. The character's thoughts tell us that he feels isolated. And in turn, that helps us form ideas about this character. Dialogue. This refers to what the character says to others and how the character says it. Examples, compare the pair. How would you like to embark on a journey to Indonesia with me? Want to go to Bali? Name. The name of the character and its connotations. For instance, Milton versus Hercules. Narratorial commentary. This refers to what the narrator says about the character and how that impacts your understanding of them. Our example for this convention is another excerpt, but from a different book called Snow Crash. It was written by Neil Stephenson, and fun fact, this book came out in 1992, and it actually coined the term metaverse. And then Facebook became Meta, and they stole the term metaverse. This is the excerpt. The deliberator lets out an involuntary roar and puts the hammer down. His emotions tell him to go back and kill that manager, get his swords out of the trunk, dive in through the little sliding window like a ninja, track him down through the moiling chaos of the microwave franchise, and confront him in a climactic thick crust apocalypse. But he thinks the same thing when someone cuts him off on the freeway, and he's never done it yet. The narratorial commentary tells the audience that the deliberator is short-fused, aggressive, and confrontational. Reactions of other characters refers to the way in which other characters interact with the character in question. Example, in The Boys, Homelander treats the Deep in a dismissive and condescending manner. What does this treatment tell us about the Deep and what sort of person he is? Better known as Nate from Gossip Girl, the original one, by the way. Physical appearance. This refers to what the character looks like, for instance, body shape and clothing, and the inferences that can be made as a result. Example, we've got Thor in Avengers Endgame versus Thor in Thor Love and Thunder. Lastly, setting. This refers to the location or locations the character is commonly associated with and the inferences that can be made as a result. Example, let's say you're introduced to a character who's sitting in a prison cell. That's all the conventions of characterization. Now let's see how we can apply them in some past WACE exam questions. Let's see how this plays out in analytical questions. This is our process. Firstly, state the character's characterization. In other words, use one or more adjectives to describe the character. Then state which conventions of characterization achieve that effect. Once again, those conventions are behavior, body language, characters' thoughts, dialogue, name, narratorial commentary, reactions of other characters, physical appearance, and setting. Then provide examples. For instance, use quotes or describe the scene using meta-language. More on that last part in one of the first lessons of Module 3. Finally, explain which language features are used in the example to achieve the effect. For instance, if you've stated body language as a relevant convention of characterization, you might consider the influence of camera angle and camera shot in conveying the certain body language. So those are our steps, and this is the first question we're going to apply them to. Explain how the use of setting shapes the construction of one of the characters in this passage. The relevant text is Collected Stories, You Gave Me Hyacinths by Janet Turner Hospital, came out 2015. The excerpt is in the PDF study notes. Follow along as I read it. Summer comes hot and steamy with the heavy smell of raw sugar from the northeast coast of Australia. The cane pushes through the rotting window blinds and grows into the cracks and corners of the mind. It ripens in the heart at night, and its crushed sweetness drips into dreams. I have woken, brushing from my eyelids the silky plumes that burst up into harvest time. And I have stood, smoke blackened, as the cane fires licked the night sky and kicked my way through the charred stubble after the men have slashed at the naked stalks and sent them churning through the mill. I have walked forever through the honeyed morning air to the crumbling high school brave outpost of another civilization. The class always seemed to be on the point of bulging out the windows. If I shut my eyes and thought hard, I could probably remember all the faces and put a name to each. One never forgets that first year out of teachers' college, the first school, the first students. Delos comes before anyone else, of course, feline and demanding, blotting out the others. Delos, who sat stonily bored through classes and never turned in homework and wrote nothing at all on test papers. Can't understand poetry, she said by way of explanation. There were detentions and earnest talks. At least I was earnest. Delos was bored. She put her case simply. I'll fail everything anyway. But you don't need to, Delos. It's a matter of your attitude, not your ability. What sort of job will you get if you don't finish high school? I'll work at Valisi's or the kitchen at the mill canteen. Yes, well, but they will be very monotonous jobs, don't you think? Very boring. Yes, flicking back the long blonde hair. Now, just supposing you finished high school, then what would you do? Same thing, work at Valisi's or in the mill canteen. Till I'm married, everybody does. You could go to Brisbane or even Sydney or Melbourne. There are any number of jobs you could get there if you were to finish high school. There would be theatres to go to, plays to see, and libraries. Delos, this town doesn't even have a library. Silence. Have you ever been out of this town, Delos? Been to Cairns once. Cairns, 20,000 people and less than 100 miles away, the local idea of the big city. Delos, what are you going to do with your life? No answer. I felt angry, as though I were the one trapped in the slow rhythm of a small tropical town. Can you possibly be content, I asked viciously, to work at the mill, get married, have babies, and grow old in this shriveled up, sun-blasted village? She was mildly puzzled at my outburst, but shrugged it off as being beyond her. Reckon I'll have to marry the first boy who knocks me up, she said. That's the excerpt. How should we approach answering the question? Main parts of the question are construction of one of the characters, which basically means characterization. The characters in the text are Delos, which is the character that we're going to analyze, and we've also got the teacher, who's the narrator. The other main part of the question is setting. As we know from the previous part of the lesson, setting is a convention of characterization. The setting of the text is early 1970s, which is the time, and it's a small country town in Queensland, which is the place, and there is a kind of monotonous mood. Everything's a bit dull. Also note that the questions focus on setting as one of the conventions of characterization doesn't mean that you can't discuss the other conventions of characterization. Sorry for the double negative. Just because setting is specified in the question, which is one of the conventions of characterization, you can also discuss other conventions of characterization. However, setting should be at least the main focus. For instance, there's a part of that excerpt where Delos says, I'll work at Valisi's or the kitchen at the mill canteen. One relevant convention there is setting, Valisi's, the mill canteen, and what those two places represent. Another convention is dialogue. What does Delos's response, I'll work at Valisi's or the kitchen at the mill, say about Dallas? Analysis. We know that we need to firstly state the character's characterization, and we could say that Dallas is characterized as an unambitious woman. Next up, state which conventions of characterization achieve that effect. We could say setting and dialogue. Then provide examples. I'll work at Valise's or the kitchen at the Mill Canteen. Been to Cairns once. Cairns is the only place outside her hometown that Dallas has been to, and it's only like 100 miles away, and she didn't really indicate that she has any ambition to go elsewhere. Then explain which language features are used in the example to achieve the effect. There are connotations of Valise's and the Mill Canteen, referring to the hospitality industry. The narrator of this text, the teacher, regards Dallas's intention to work at Valise's or the Mill Canteen in the hospitality industry as unambitious. Ellipsis, I have been to Cairns versus been to Cairns once. She's using very short responses, indicating that she's quite uninvested, quite bored by the conversation she's having with the teacher, and that conversation is all about her future. And then we've got the connotation of Cairns, which I mentioned earlier. It's only 100 miles away from where Dallas lives. I explained these 3 language features in more depth in the PDF study notes. Hopefully you were reading along as I was going through those. If not, go and check them out now. Come back once you're done. That question that we just looked at was an example of a question that directly mentions or refers to the concept of characterization. As we can see, this next question doesn't. What I want to do for this example is to show you how you can incorporate a discussion about characterization in a question that doesn't explicitly mention the concept characterization. Our sample text is a scene from one of the greatest movies of all time, The Incredibles. There's a link to the scene in the resources tab below this video. Give it a watch, come back once you're done. No capes. Approaching the question. How should we answer the question? The important parts of this question are different perspectives. A perspective is just basically a viewpoint. We'll get into that later in this module. And different perspectives just means roughly at least 2 viewpoints that aren't the same. Another important part of this question is the term controversy. That just refers to a prolonged public disagreement or heated discussion. Applying the meaning of those words to the Incredibles scene, we can come up with something like this. Edna's perspective, no capes. Mr. Incredible's perspective, I want a cape. The controversy is whether superhero suits should have capes. At this stage, you might be wondering how characterization comes into the mix of this question. We're incorporating characterization by asking ourselves, how has the characterization of Edna and Mr. Incredible revealed their differing viewpoints on the controversy of whether superheroes should wear capes? With that in mind, let's get into the analysis. Firstly, state the character's characterization. Edna, she's characterized as stubborn and bossy. Mr. Incredible is characterized as impressionable, persuadable, suggestible. Then state which conventions of characterization achieve that effect. With Edna, the main conventions are through her behavior and dialogue. With Mr. Incredible, the main conventions are body language and dialogue. Examples. For Edna, her behavior, she throws a piece of paper at Mr. Incredible's head. She interrupts Mr. Incredible multiple times whenever he tries to present his own viewpoint on the idea of wearing a cape. And she dismisses Mr. Incredible after saying, no capes, without giving him a chance to really say anything. Dialogue, no capes. How about Mr. Incredible? His body language, he's sitting upright, then slumps down in his chair after Edna interrupts him and starts telling tragic stories about superheroes who have died by way of wearing their capes. Dialogue, an example of that, he says unconfidently, isn't that my decision? Next step in the analysis, explain which language features are used in the example to achieve the effect. With Edna, behavior, an extreme close-up, eye-level camera shot depicts the determination in Edna's eyes and portrays her to be a force to be reckoned with, despite her small stature relative to Mr. Incredible. Ultimately, this has the effect of silencing Mr. Incredible's voice and ensuring that her own viewpoint prevails. Then there's the dialogue. Specifically, the pace and volume of her speech makes her sound quite assertive and conclusive, as though Mr. Incredible's viewpoint is just completely irrelevant. That's Edna going back to Mr. Incredible, Body language. As mentioned earlier, we've got his posture. As Mr. Incredible slumps down in his chair once Edna interrupts him, the audience is told that Mr. Incredible feels less confident expressing his viewpoint and that Edna can basically command him. Then, turning to dialogue, there's a bit of a passive tone, as opposed to, say, an active tone. Passive, isn't that my decision? Versus active, that's my decision. The passive tone makes Mr. Incredible sound submissive. As we know, the question is from the responding section, and I thought it would be helpful to outline a topic sentence in response to the question that addresses the main element of it while referring to the concept of characterization. Edna Mode and Mr. Incredible are characterized to represent different perspectives on the controversy of whether superheroes should wear capes. I'd like you to cross-reference that topic sentence with the actual WACE exam question and just consider the extent to which this topic sentence addresses the main elements of the question. In other words, the extent to which it answers the question. Hopefully you've noticed that the sentence pretty much directly answers the question while also incorporating this additional element of characterization. That's analyzing the conventions of characterization. Now let's check out creating conventions of characterization. This focuses on how to use the conventions of characterization to create ideas about characters in an imaginative text, specifically in the composing section of the exam. What's our process? Characterization should involve determining in your plan for an imaginative text the characters or characters' characterization. In other words, use one or more adjectives to describe the character. Then, which conventions of characterization you'll prioritize to achieve that effect. Once again, those conventions of characterization are behavior, body language, characters' thoughts, dialogue, name, narratorial commentary, reactions of other characters, physical appearance, and setting. Our last step in the process involves determining which language features you'll employ to achieve the effect. If you've determined that dialogue is a convention that you'll prioritize, you might, for instance, decide to employ slang and filler words. This is the question we're going to analyze. Create an imaginative text in a particular genre with an atypical setting. 2018 WACE exam, section 3, question 13. Approaching the question. Firstly, what are the main parts? One of the main parts is the term imaginative text, which tells us that the genre of form and structure of the text that we create must fall within the general category of an imaginative text. For instance, a short story, that would be the main option, but you could also write the beginning of a novel. Another main part of the question is the term particular genre, which tells us that we can choose which genre of subject matter our story will fall within. For instance, action, comedy, dystopia, etc. Another main part of the question is the term atypical setting, which just means a setting that isn't typically chosen in the genre of subject matter. For instance, a rom-com that takes place in a prison. Before we get stuck into the analysis, I'd like to highlight that characterization is relevant in this question, generally speaking, because any imaginative text is going to have at least one character in it. And specifically, texts that fall within the genres of subject matter, romance, and comedy typically center around the relationship of two people, two characters. In other words, the characterization of those two people in a rom-com is very important. Our analysis. Firstly, the character's characterization. Notice the plural characters. Character 1, we could say, is jaded and cynical. Character 2, we could say, is enthusiastic and optimistic. By the way, this is assuming that the story is taking place in the atypical setting of a prison. Next step in the analysis, conventions of characterization you'll prioritize to achieve that effect. For character 1, one of the biggest conventions could be dialogue. Specifically, character 1 could swear a lot. Reactions of other characters. For instance, character 2 initially thinks character 1's cynicism is amusing. Name, Jim. Physical appearance, tattoos, middle age, gut, shaved head. Character 2, dialogue, well-spoken. Reaction of other characters. Character 1 initially thinks character 2 is obnoxious. Name, Callum. Physical appearance, muscular, mid-30s, curly hair. Next step in the analysis, language features you'll employ to achieve the effect. For character 1, you'd use slang, emotive language, short syntax. For character 2, could use enunciation, descriptive language, long syntax, etc. That is all I wanted to say about this example about creating conventions of characterization, and that is all the main content of the lesson. Let's do a simple summary. In the first part of the lesson, we defined the term characterization, and our definition is the process by which ideas about a character are constructed and conveyed. Next part of the lesson discussed types of characterization, and the first type we saw was audience characterization, which refers to the process by which an audience constructs ideas about a character. The other type of characterization is author characterization. Our definition for that one is the process by which an author conveys ideas about a character. Then we looked at the types of characterization compared, what makes them different. Really, the difference comes down to audience characterization is applicable to analytical questions, which come from the comprehending and responding sections, and author characterization is applicable to creative questions, which are from the composing section. The key takeaway for this part of the lesson was that the ideas an author conveys about a character sometimes differ from those that an audience constructs about that character. The example for this one was the 1997 movie Batman and Robin. It's doubtful the director, Joel Schumacher, implied any particular meaning by including nipples on the batsuit, but the audience, they inferred or created their own meaning about that suit, which was basically that it was a joke. Many memes were created from it. Next section of the lesson discussed conventions of characterization, probably the main part of this lesson. Those conventions are behavior, body language, characters' thoughts, dialogue, name, narratorial commentary, reactions of other characters, physical appearance, and setting. Finally, we looked at past WACE exam questions. We saw that when analyzing conventions of characterization, our process is that we should state the character's characterization using one or more adjectives, then state which conventions of characterization achieve that effect, then provide examples, then explain which language features are used in the example or examples to achieve the effect. Finally, we looked at creating conventions of characterization, which really applied to imaginative texts in the composing section. We saw that characterization should involve determining in your plan for an imaginative text the character or characters' characterization, which conventions of characterization you'll prioritize to achieve that effect, and finally, which language features you'll employ to achieve the effect. That is all I wanted to say about characterization. As I mentioned at the beginning of this lesson, you need to know about characterization if you're studying a text that has a character in it. You can consolidate all the stuff that we just learned in this lesson by completing the related activities. It's just one text table. It won't take long. Go do that. I'll see you in the next lesson, which is about narrative point of view. Easily one of the most important lessons in this module. I'll see you there. Until then, keep it simple.